China has just been caught. Two Chinese nationals were recently captured fighting alongside Russia in eastern Ukraine. It adds fuel to an already burning question of how deeply China is involved in supporting Russia. Now, 100,000 NATO troops could be ready to enter Ukraine and even out the odds of Chinese support. But what is the story of these Chinese nationals? Are they active in the Chinese military, or are they merely mercenaries who have chosen to fight alongside Putin's forces? Could this perhaps give NATO enough reason to send troops to Ukraine? Let's unpack. Reuters and First Post were among the first to report on April 8 that two Chinese nationals have been captured on the Eastern Front, a currently occupied part of Ukraine, which includes the Donetsk region. The fight here has been eventful over the last year, especially during the middle part of 2024. President Vladimir Putin has been focusing heavily on taking control of the region, which is absolutely vital to peace talks, should they ever happen. In fact, President Putin could be eyeing Donetsk for more than just peace talks. It is home to 20 of Ukraine's biggest coal mines, and with 15 of these under state control, it could be another avenue of mining and exports for the Kremlin to exploit. With estimates putting the production in these areas at more than 11 million tons annually, it could theoretically add more than $1.1 billion to the Russian fiscus. This would go a long way to funding the current military operations, which seems to be dwindling after numerous rounds of international sanctions. It is also worth keeping in mind that the Eastern Front has always been important to the Russian president, largely due to its big Russian-speaking population. Around the Donbas region was also the first place President Putin launched his attacks in 2014, focusing on a narrative of liberating these citizens who identify themselves more as part of Russia rather than Ukraine. The Donbas region is also full of Putin loyalists, who helped Russian troops in the move against Crimea. This made for a largely overwhelming force, which led to the eventual annexation of Crimea. Meanwhile, pro-Russian citizens began forming proxies and establishing the People's Republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. Despite Russia losing both these regions following the war, and more than 80% of people voicing their displeasure of the Russian invasion, President Vladimir Putin has doubled down on retaking the region. This could explain why Chinese soldiers might have been sent to the front lines. Perhaps Russia is running out of forces, especially given the fact that the Kremlin recently announced another round of drafting. As for these two soldiers, the Ukrainian president took a firm stance when the news broke, having the following to say: "We have information that there are many more Chinese citizens in the occupiers' units than just two. We are now finding out all the facts. I have instructed the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine to immediately contact Beijing and find out how China is going to react to this." This is kind of worrisome for Kyiv, who have also confirmed they have information suggesting the contingent of troops occupying these regions have more Chinese nationals than just the two who have been announced. A major question this has left on the minds of people is whether this is an isolated incident, or has China sent actual members of the Chinese army to shore up the Russian lines? So far, media outlets have reported that there is no evidence to suggest that this could be the case, and it is far more likely that these soldiers were acting with their own impunity. In essence, it is a similar situation to Western mercenaries joining Ukrainian forces at the beginning of the war to help the Ukraine military. A much more likely situation would be that Russia is currently welcoming every soldier they can, paying them to add more bodies to the front line. And this could be worrisome for Kyiv, given the allies that Russia currently has. But this isn't the first time that something like this has happened. Starting in mid-2024, news broke of about 12,000 North Korean troops being sent to Ukraine. This was again announced on March 27th, when another 3,000 North Koreans found themselves fighting in a war they didn't truly understand. Moreover, French media outlet Le Monde reported just days earlier that a man by the name of Fenn had been caught fighting alongside Russian soldiers. However, it was quickly established that he was nothing more than a paid mercenary. The rest of the interview suggests that Fenn was merely a man without a mission living in China, and by choosing to go to Moscow, he found a real purpose that would have given him some kind of paycheck as well. However, Le Monde didn't stop there. More research into various Chinese social media accounts paints a grim picture. At least 40 of these accounts not only contain content focused on the war, but also have actual photographic evidence of these people operating in Ukraine. But information gathered from Fenn, who had miraculously survived a Ukrainian drone strike, gives a lot more information about what is driving Chinese citizens to take up arms in Russia. Various reports from around the world suggest that throughout the conflict, Russian soldiers have been averaging a paycheck of about $750 per month. This is not enough for any foreigner to join the battlefield, but it was recently announced that the pay will rise to between $2,000 and $3,000 per month. In many poorer countries, including China, this is far more than the local average wage. According to Fenn himself, he was offered about $2,000 pay per month while he was working for Putin. Despite serving most of his time from a Russian military hospital, Fenn still made a lot more than the average Chinese citizen back in 2023. In fact, it was almost double, with the average Chinese paycheck being $1,370 per month. This major increase in pay has led to many reports surfacing of more and more Chinese troops entering the war zone. And in March 2024, a Russian military blogger by the name of Pavel Kukushkin confirmed this. Not only are there suggestions of Chinese troops, but footage actually shows them conversing with Russian soldiers. One spoke Russian and the other Chinese. Using an electronic translator, the men were able to communicate. The footage also suggests that there are more and more Chinese soldiers arriving, and the brigade stationed in the region has been slowly ramped up, especially in terms of numbers. It has become a real problem for President Zelensky, again having the following to say after this incredible find. Russia's involvement of China in this war in Europe, directly or indirectly, is a clear signal that Putin is going to do anything except end the war. The Ukrainian president might be onto something with his recent comments, and perhaps the Russian president is seeking a way to prolong the war without sacrificing too many of his own citizens in the process. The arrival of North Korean troops makes this a real reality for Kiev. In fact, President Putin has been clear on his terms for ending the war, saying that he will not stop any war unless the United States can help him find the root cause of the problem in Ukraine. This doesn't bode well for a broken Ukraine, which now also must deal with one of its biggest partners not being willing to continue funding. Meanwhile, China will need to provide answers for this geopolitical misstep and explain that they didn't have any knowledge of these things happening. However, media coverage and even professional bloggers are now making it extremely hard for Beijing to continue its denial of having any involvement in this war. But it is not only China that is providing these mercenaries. Various intelligence reports have also cited countries like Serbia, Cuba, and more shockingly, India, who might have sent mercenaries to fight alongside Russia. On top of this, countries with whom Russia has been a staunch defender like Syria, Iran, and even Yemeni soldiers have been found in the war. It is surprising to see the Houthis, especially given the fact that the current troubles with the United States might mean all hands could be needed to prevent the situation from turning even more dire. The bottom line to all this is that the Russian president is welcoming any mercenary willing to lay his life on the line and ensure that Russia could possibly win this war. But there could be another reason behind this. With so many corpses, the Kremlin must answer questions daily, and families within Russia are now becoming less and less supportive of this war effort. Hundreds of thousands of troops have lost their lives since the war kicked off in 2022. On top of this, a counteroffensive launched by Ukraine in August 2024 took large swaths of Russian territory, especially in Kursk. This meant that the Kremlin essentially had to divert troops from other front lines and redeploy them in the region. It was the main reason for the uptake of North Korean troops who found themselves in a war they didn't understand back in 2024. Both of these reasons have enough merits to suggest that Putin is trying to ensure battlefield gains, without too much pressure being placed on his own forces. As for China, there could be a very slight possibility that they are actually assisting in funding and supporting this war. Since China is planning a takeover of Taiwan, they might be sending troops to gain some combat experience. Yes, the People's Liberation Army fields about 2.8 million active troops. They are not battle-hardened, with many of them having never even seen an active conflict. Compared to the United States, which has been waging wars since the end of World War II, it makes sense that China could be seeking some combat experience. Moreover, the Chinese Communist Party has a long-standing policy that it doesn't get involved in the business of other countries. This means that, even though various conflicts are kicking off around them, they simply stay out. A good example of this is the current situation in Myanmar. As of this video, China has yet to choose a side, and using some of these proxy war situations is often a great way for countries to build on their combat experience. Unfortunately, this isn't the case for the People's Liberation Army. But as this is happening, it is creating more questions than it is delivering answers. The world wants to know exactly what China's stance is on the war and where these soldiers are coming from. Essentially, Ukraine was forced to summon the Chinese consulate in a meeting that is yet to happen, but we can expect that some stern words will be spoken, and China will need to answer a few tough questions. China has not yet responded to the initial questions posed by President Zelensky, having no comment to most of it. But this, again, is understandable with the current situation between Beijing and Washington kicking into overdrive. With a trade war not just brewing, but in full swing now, the CCP has its hands full. As of this video, the United States has again raised tariffs to 125%. Following China's raise to 84%, the world is now awaiting Beijing's response. This might have already happened by the time you watch this video. However, if it is determined that actual Chinese troops are meddling about in Ukraine, it could open the door for something far more severe, something that President Vladimir Putin would much rather just want to avoid. By China entering the war, it will create a massive imbalance. Since Russia is fighting a war of attrition, the war has turned into a meat grinder, and who has more troops to sacrifice than China. With over 2.8 million servicemen, losing 500,000 wouldn't do nearly as much damage to China's army than it would to Russia. But such an imbalance will likely be met with a very staunch response from NATO, who have repeatedly suggested sending boots to Ukraine. This includes France, the United Kingdom, Turkey, and possibly even Germany. However, the latter still needs to figure out how they can field a substantial army. So, what does this spell for the war, and will NATO intervene? The likelihood of NATO pulling the trigger and actually sending troops to Ukraine is not high. Should NATO intervene, Russia will see this as a direct escalation, but what NATO forces could do is send more and more support. They can potentially station troops in Ukraine in a supporting role, slowly freeing up more frontline troops for Ukraine to utilize. A move like this could have serious implications for an already failing Russian onslaught. Moreover, it could add some much-needed support for Ukraine, given the fact that they have also been suffering battlefield losses. But NATO would need a reason that suggests Putin is involving other military powers directly for such a case to be made. Putin will likely respond with further nuclear threats, as he has done by changing Russian nuclear policy and readying these weapons. However, the probability of it actually happening remains low. The world is nowhere near the level of tension that was created during the 1980s under the Reagan administration. Should more military equipment make it to Ukraine, it carries the likelihood of Russia losing more and more troops. This will ramp up casualties, forcing the Kremlin to seek more deals and troops to join its front lines. Essentially, this move could have been a costly blunder for Moscow, now forcing them to pay more for troops, while having to deal with the potential setback of public opinion when they slowly lose more troops. On the other hand, China could perhaps send troops to Russia in an official capacity. Recent tariffs have created a war of itself, where both the US and China are now playing hardball. Who will blink first? This tariff war has led to a deeper weakening in relationships between Beijing and Washington, and China might find itself in a desperate position, having to make more deals with Russia. Despite China raising important tariffs on US products by 84%, US Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent says, so what? According to Bessent, China is exporting about 5 times more to the United States than is the other way around. This means that Beijing will inevitably lose a trade war. China might use Russia as a contingency, threatening to inject itself into this conflict. This could essentially become a major proxy war between Trump and Xi Jinping. Since the Russian economy is on the verge of collapse, it only makes sense that Putin will turn to China, and this could create a scenario where Russia becomes a proxy of China. You can bet your life that this means the United States is obligated to ramp up support for Ukraine. But these Chinese soldiers are more than an embarrassment to Beijing. It reveals that citizens would rather risk their lives fighting in an unwinnable war than live on peanuts in China. But what do you think? Does Russia have anything left in the tank, or are they secretly striking a deal with Beijing? Let us know in the comments, and make sure you like and subscribe to our channel for your daily military report.